A white teacher cut off the hair of a black teenage girl in front of her entire class, sparking laughter and humiliation. But what they didn't know was that this girl was not as powerless as they thought. Her mother, an attorney with a fierce commitment to justice, would stop at nothing to make sure her daughter's dignity was restored. What started as an act of humiliation would turn into a legal battle that no one saw coming. The resilience and strength of a black woman would bring them to justice and make them pay for their actions. Aaliyah Johnson sat in the front row, just as she always did. She could hear the whispers, the muffled laughter behind her, but she didn't let it show. Westbrook Academy, with its sprawling manicured lawns and ivy-covered buildings, felt like a world far removed from the life she knew. As the only black student in her class, Aaliyah had quickly learned to adapt, to keep her head down and avoid standing out in a place where fitting in seemed like the ultimate goal. At just 14, she was already well aware that she was different, but there was something about being constantly reminded of that difference that gnawed at her. Her hair, her proud, natural afro, was the focus of most of the ridicule. She had long stopped counting the number of times her classmates had made cruel jokes about it. Ghetto, unprofessional, untamed. They used those words like darts, aimed right at her identity. Even some of the teachers weren't immune to the temptation of commenting on her appearance. But it wasn't just her hair, it was everything. Aaliyah had earned her place at Westbrook through a scholarship, but no matter how hard she worked, no matter how many grades she aced, there was always the nagging sense that she wasn't quite welcome. Every day, she faced this subtle exclusion, the whispered insults, and the dismissive stares from her classmates. The boys would joke about her hair, calling it a distraction, or worse, mimicking it with mockery. The girls would giggle behind her back, casting quick, judgmental glances whenever she walked past. Some days, Aaliyah could ignore them, burying herself in her work, focusing on the academic challenges that came easily to her. Other days, the weight of it all became unbearable. It wasn't just the students. Mrs. Carter, the history teacher, was a particular source of tension. Aaliyah had admired Mrs. Carter when she first arrived. She was known for her sharp mind and her passion for history. But over time, Mrs. Carter's judgmental comments about Aaliyah's hair had grown more frequent. Every time Aaliyah stood in front of the class to answer a question or give a presentation, Mrs. Carter's eyes would linger on her hair, her lips pressing into a tight line. Aaliyah could see it in her eyes, that disapproval, the way she made an effort to mention Aaliyah's unprofessional appearance in front of the class, as though it was part of the lesson. "Aaliyah," Mrs. Carter would say, a practiced smile on her face, "could you please make sure your hair is more subdued? It's a bit distracting when we're discussing the Treaty of Versailles." The room would always fall into a strange, uncomfortable silence. Her classmates would snicker, their eyes flicking from Aaliyah to Mrs. Carter, waiting for her to respond. But Aaliyah had learned that no response was the best response. She simply nodded, pretending not to hear the undertones in Mrs. Carter's voice, and focused on the material, hoping to outrun the embarrassment. In the halls, during lunch, and even in the classroom, Aaliyah had become used to the whispered remarks and the sideways glances. There was always a sense of distance, a constant reminder that she was an outsider. At first, she tried to fight it. She tried to speak out to correct the misconceptions, but that only seemed to make things worse. It wasn't enough to be brilliant at her studies, to excel in every subject. It wasn't enough to win every debate or write flawless essays. For them, her excellence only seemed to provoke more hostility. She learned quickly that her intellect, her brilliance, made her a target. It wasn't just her hair. It was her refusal to conform, her unwillingness to diminish herself to fit the mold that Westbrook expected her to occupy. Aaliyah wasn't just a scholarship student. She was a reminder of the inequities and biases that ran deep within the institution. It wasn't the quality of her work that bothered them. It was the fact that she refused to shrink in the face of their prejudice. But through it all, Aaliyah held her head high. Her natural hair, once a source of shame, became a symbol of her resilience, her identity, and her strength. She wore it proudly, even when it meant enduring more ridicule. She knew that her future was bigger than the small, narrow views of the people around her. She would rise above them. Despite the constant barrage of insults and criticisms, Aaliyah never wavered. She focused on her studies, determined to prove her worth through the only thing that had ever been truly hers, her intelligence. Every A+ on a test, every flawless essay, every speech and debate was her quiet act of resistance against a world that tried to tell her she didn't belong. In the quiet moments when she walked through the halls of Westbrook Academy, Aaliyah could hear the whispers, the laughter, and the judgments, but she learned to tune them out. The only thing that mattered was her next challenge, her next goal, and the unwavering belief that one day her worth would be seen, not just for her grades, but for who she was as a person. The morning of October 15th began like any other. Aaliyah Johnson sat in her usual seat at the front of the classroom, her textbooks neatly arranged on her desk, and her sharp mind focused on the lesson. It was advanced world history, a subject she loved. Mrs. Carter, the history teacher, was droning on about the French Revolution, but Aaliyah's thoughts were already ahead, mentally preparing for her next exam. She had become used to the quiet, unspoken animosity of her classmates, the subtle sneers and side glances directed at her wild, natural afro. But she had learned to tune it out, to focus on her work and ignore the noise. But today was different. As she sat there, absorbing the lesson, she felt a tug on her hair. At first, it was light, a passing brush that she thought might have been an accident. But then, there was another tug, harder this time, and muffled laughter from behind her. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized what was happening. Aaliyah didn't turn around. She couldn't. She had learned early that acknowledging the harassment only made it worse. Her fingers gripped the edge of her desk tightly, the pressure helping her keep calm. But then she heard it, the unmistakable metallic sound of scissors opening. Her stomach dropped. Before she could even react, the scissors were in her hair. Mrs. Carter, the teacher, had walked up behind her with a gleam of judgment in her eyes, scissors in hand. Aaliyah froze, her breath catching in her throat as Mrs. Carter snipped a large chunk of her afro, right there in front of the whole class. The sound of the scissors cutting through her hair was followed by the sickening crunch of her identity being torn away. Laughter erupted around her, filling the room with cruel echoes. Some students laughed outright, others tried to stifle their giggles, but the damage was done. Her hair, her pride, her identity was being cut away in front of her classmates, and she couldn't stop it. Her hand flew to the back of her head, her fingers trembling as she tried to feel the damage. The hair she had so carefully maintained was now a jagged mess. She turned slowly, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. Mrs. Carter stood there, scissors still in hand, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. She looked around at the class, as though waiting for approval. "There," she said, with a tone of finality, "that's much better." The class continued to laugh, some louder than others. The few who had remained silent now joined in, seemingly enjoying the spectacle. Aaliyah's heart shattered with each passing second, but she didn't cry. She couldn't. Not here. Not in front of these people. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. Her hands shook, and she could feel the weight of the humiliation bearing down on her. She tried to remain composed, to hold herself together, but every snicker, every whispered comment, felt like a knife twisting in her chest. The room buzzed with mockery, but Aaliyah wasn't listening anymore. Her mind was racing, processing what had just happened. It wasn't just an accident. It wasn't a spontaneous act of cruelty. This had been deliberate, a carefully planned act of humiliation. Aaliyah realized, in that moment, that this wasn't just about her hair. It was about everything. Her being there at all, her presence in a place where she didn't belong, her refusal to shrink into the mold they expected her to fit. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. She had been humiliated, yes, but she also felt something stronger growing inside her, a fire, a determination. She wasn't just going to let this slide. She wasn't going to let them erase her. Aaliyah stood up slowly, her movements deliberate and measured. The laughter from the class grew quieter, but she didn't care. She walked toward Mrs. Carter's desk with a purpose, her every step echoing in the now silent room. Mrs. Carter turned toward her, still holding the scissors, a smug expression still on her face. Aaliyah's voice broke through the silence, steady and calm, but full of power. "Mrs. Carter," she said, her words cutting through the tension in the room like a knife. "I need to report an assault." For a moment, Mrs. Carter's expression faltered, and she tried to brush it off. "Aaliyah, it's just a little haircut," she said dismissively, as if it was no big deal. But Aaliyah stood her ground, her eyes narrowing. "A little haircut," Aaliyah repeated, her voice rising now. "You've cut a part of me, Mrs. Carter. You've humiliated me in front of the entire class, and you think that's okay?" The room was silent. Mrs. Carter's face flushed, but she still tried to downplay it. "Aaliyah, I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. Please sit back down." But Aaliyah didn't move. She wasn't going to sit down and pretend like nothing had happened. She wasn't going to let them make her the joke. She stood tall, her head held high, despite the tears that threatened to fall. She didn't care about their laughter anymore. She didn't care about their opinions. She cared about one thing, taking control. "I'm going to report this," Aaliyah said, her voice firm. "And I'll make sure this school knows what just happened. Because this," she gestured to her hair, now uneven and ragged, "this is assault, and I won't stand for it." The class remained quiet as Aaliyah walked out of the room, her head held high, her heart still racing. She didn't know what was next, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. Aaliyah walked into her apartment with a heavy heart, but as soon as she stepped inside, something caught her mother's eye. Aaliyah Johnson, a seasoned attorney with years of experience in civil rights law, knew instantly that something was terribly wrong. She was sitting at the kitchen table when she looked up, her sharp gaze falling on her daughter. Aaliyah's face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying, and her hair, well, it was a jagged mess. The neat, proud afro Aaliyah had always worn with pride was now uneven, chopped at the edges as if some cruel hand had decided it no longer belonged. Lila stood up immediately, her pulse quickening with concern. "Aaliyah, what happened?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with worry. Aaliyah looked at her mother, struggling to hold back her tears. She couldn't speak for a moment. The hurt from the classroom still lingered in the pit of her stomach. How could this have happened? How could someone, especially a teacher, do something so malicious? Her voice shook as she recounted the events, describing how Mrs. Carter, the history teacher at Westbrook Academy, had walked up to her while she was in class, scissors in hand, and made the first cut. The laughter from her classmates, the humiliating sense of helplessness. Aaliyah's words tumbled out in a rush, the memories of the cruelty still fresh in her mind. Lila listened intently, her jaw tightening with every word her daughter spoke. She had always known that the world could be an unforgiving place, but this was beyond what she had ever anticipated for her daughter. She had raised Aaliyah to be strong, to stand tall despite adversity, but this was an attack on her daughter's very identity. The thought of anyone touching her daughter in such a way, of her daughter being humiliated in front of a group of students, ignited a fire inside Lila. When Aaliyah finished, Lila stood silently for a moment, processing what she had just heard. Then, she did what she always did when faced with injustice. She got to work. "I'm going to take action," Lila said, her voice calm but firm. "This is not just a case of bullying. It's discrimination, it's assault, and I won't let this go." Aaliyah looked up at her mother, surprised. "Mom, what are you going to do?" Lila's eyes were already scanning the room, her legal mind already working through the steps. "I'm going to sue Westbrook Academy and Mrs. Carter," she said. "What they did to you is unacceptable. You have every right to be treated with respect and dignity." Lila immediately began gathering evidence, pulling together witness statements, student testimonies, and anything that could be used to prove that this was not a simple act of teasing or bullying. It was a deliberate and premeditated act of racial discrimination. The cutting of Aaliyah's hair wasn't just about hair. It was about control, about silencing her, about making her feel inferior because of the way she looked. Lila knew this was much bigger than one isolated incident. It was a symptom of a toxic environment at Westbrook, a place where privilege and power had shielded those who needed to be held accountable. Over the next few days, Lila worked tirelessly. She contacted the families of students who had witnessed the incident, trying to piece together the full story. She combed through legal documentation, searching for precedents that could help build her case. She even spoke with a few allies in the community who were passionate about fighting racial injustice in education. The more she uncovered, the more certain she became. This fight was necessary, not just for Aaliyah, but for all the students who were marginalized, ridiculed, and silenced at places like Westbrook Academy. The case quickly gained attention. News outlets picked up the story, and advocates for racial justice rallied behind Aaliyah. The story of the 14-year-old black girl who had been publicly humiliated by a teacher because of her natural hair was a rallying cry. It sparked conversations across the country about systemic racism in schools and the lack of accountability for teachers who perpetuated discriminatory practices. Westbrook Academy, known for its elite status and prestigious reputation, was suddenly under a microscope, forced to address a situation they had hoped would quietly disappear. As the case moved to court, Lila prepared for the battle of a lifetime. She knew this was bigger than one school, one teacher, and one student. This was about standing up for every young person who had been told their identity, their culture, and their bodies weren't enough. This was about sending a message that racial discrimination in any form would not be tolerated, especially in schools meant to shape the future. When the court session began, Lila stood at the front of the room, representing her daughter, her voice unwavering. She presented a compelling case, outlining the emotional distress and the trauma Aaliyah had endured, the premeditated nature of the act, and the school's failure to protect its students from racial discrimination. Mrs. Carter's actions were not just a personal failure. They were a reflection of the wider systemic issues that had allowed such behavior to thrive unchecked. The defense, representing Westbrook Academy, tried to downplay the incident. They argued that Mrs. Carter had not intended to harm Aaliyah and that the cutting of her hair was an isolated mistake. They claimed that the school was a respected institution with high standards and that the teacher had simply misjudged the situation. But Lila wasn't buying it. She presented witness testimony, showing that Mrs. Carter's actions had been preceded by years of subtle and not so subtle remarks about Aaliyah's hair. Lila also revealed the pattern of negligence within the school, where faculty and administration had failed to intervene when students like Aaliyah were targeted for their race. She made it clear that the issue wasn't just one teacher's behavior. It was a reflection of a larger culture of racial bias that needed to be addressed. The truth was undeniable. Mrs. Carter's actions were motivated by racial bias, and Westbrook Academy had failed in its duty to protect all students. The judge, after hearing all the evidence, ruled in favor of Aaliyah. The school was ordered to pay reparations to Aaliyah for the emotional and psychological harm she had suffered, and Mrs. Carter was dismissed from her position. More importantly, the school was mandated to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination policies and provide sensitivity training to all staff members. When the decision was made, Aaliyah felt a mix of relief and empowerment. She had not only stood up for herself, but she had also helped to bring about change. The victory wasn't just personal. It was a triumph for every student who had ever been told they didn't belong, for every person who had been made to feel inferior because of their identity. As the news spread, Aaliyah became a symbol of strength, resilience, and the fight for justice. Her story was a reminder that even in the face of institutionalized racism and bias, one person, one voice, could make a difference. Westbrook Academy, once seen as a prestigious institution that was above reproach, now faced a new reality. They had been forced to confront their own failings, and they could no longer hide behind their wealth and influence. The case was a turning point not just for the school, but for the larger conversation about race and discrimination in education. For Aaliyah, the journey was far from over. She had won her case, but but her fight for justice was just beginning. Her victory in the courtroom was a testament to the power of speaking out, of standing firm in the face of adversity, and of refusing to be silenced. The weeks following the courtroom victory were a blur for Aaliyah. At first, she didn't quite understand the magnitude of what had happened. The attention, the praise, the support, it was all so overwhelming. But it didn't take long for the weight of her victory to settle into something more powerful, more profound. She had done it. She had stood up to the system that had tried to break her, and she had won. But even more than that, she had transformed. Aaliyah had always been a brilliant student. Her intellect was sharp, her drive unyielding. But now, after everything that had transpired, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She no longer walked through the halls of Westbrook Academy with her head down, trying to blend in. She held her head high, her proud natural hair a symbol of her resilience. Her confidence, once fractured by ridicule, was now unshakable. She had faced the darkest moments of her life and come out stronger on the other side. Her grades soared even higher, her essays more incisive, her speeches more compelling. Teachers who once overlooked her now sought her out for her insights. Classmates who had once whispered behind her back now offered their respect. Aaliyah's hard work, her refusal to be silenced, had earned her more than just academic accolades. It had earned her a place of influence. When the time came for the senior class to choose a valedictorian, it was no surprise that Aaliyah was the clear choice. Her academic record was impeccable, but it was her courage, her unwavering stand for justice, that truly set her apart. The committee had seen how she had become a symbol of resilience, not just for the marginalized students of color, but for everyone at Westbrook who had ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or silenced. Graduation day arrived in a blur of excitement and emotion. Aaliyah stood at the back of the auditorium, waiting for her turn to speak. She glanced around, seeing the faces of her classmates, some familiar, some strangers, but all of them now witnesses to her transformation. She was no longer the quiet scholarship student who tried to fit in. She was Aaliyah Johnson, a force to be reckoned with. As she walked up to the podium, her heart pounded, but her hands were steady. The microphone squeaked as she adjusted it, and then she began. "Good evening," she started, her voice strong and clear, "and thank you for giving me the honor of standing here today. This day is not just about the end of our high school careers. It's about the journey that got us here. The struggles, the challenges, the obstacles. None of us would be here if it weren't for the strength we've had to find within ourselves." Aaliyah paused, looking out at her classmates. She could feel the weight of their gaze, but this time, it didn't intimidate her. She was not the same person she had been just a year ago. "I think back to the beginning of my time at Westbrook," she continued, "and I remember feeling like an outsider. I remember the looks, the jokes, the whispers. I remember being told that I didn't belong here. But I also remember something else. I remember that I refused to shrink. I refused to let anyone tell me that who I was, that my identity, was something to be ashamed of." The room was silent now, every eye fixed on her. A year ago, I was humiliated in front of my classmates, ridiculed for something I could never change, my hair, my natural, beautiful hair. And in that moment, I felt like I was being cut down to size, made to feel small and insignificant. But what I realized in that moment was that they didn't just try to cut my hair, they tried to cut me. They tried to erase my identity. They thought they could humiliate me into silence. But I didn't stay silent. I stood up. And that's what we all need to remember. Standing up for yourself, for your identity, for what's right, is the most powerful thing you can do. Aaliyah's voice broke through the room like a tidal wave, steady and unwavering. Some of you might know me as the scholarship kid, the one who came from a different neighborhood, the one who was always a little different. And that's fine, because I've learned that our differences are what make us strong. We can't allow the world to define us by its narrow standards. We can't let anyone tell us that we don't belong, that we're not good enough, or that our identity is something to be ashamed of. She glanced down at her family, who sat in the front row, her mother, Lila, beaming with pride. Aaliyah could see the tears in her eyes, but also a fierce sense of pride. Her mother had been with her every step of the way, supporting her through the battles, teaching her that no matter how difficult the fight, she should never back down. I stand here today not just for myself, but for all of us, Aaliyah said, her voice rising. We've all faced challenges, we've all been judged, and we've all had to fight for our place in this world. But we've made it, and we will continue to make it, because we are strong, and we are capable, and we are worthy. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Aaliyah had transformed from the girl who had once been afraid to speak up into the young woman who now spoke with authority and conviction. She paused for a moment, taking in the significance of the moment. The applause was loud, but it wasn't just for her. It was for all of them, the students who had been overlooked, the ones who had been pushed aside, the ones who had been told they didn't belong. And I leave you with this, she said, smiling. No one can take away who you are. No one can erase your identity. So own it. Stand tall, and never apologize for taking up space, because you have earned it. As the crowd erupted into applause, Aaliyah stood tall, a symbol of resilience, strength, and transformation. She had become more than just a valedictorian. She had become a beacon of hope for all those who had ever been told they didn't matter. Westbrook Academy, the institution that had tried to tear her down, had been forced to reckon with its own actions. The school had started to change its policies, implementing new sensitivity training and promoting inclusivity. But it was Aaliyah's bravery, her refusal to be silenced, that had sparked the real transformation. And as she walked off the stage, the weight of the moment settling into her bones, Aaliyah knew that this was just the beginning. She had proven that one person, armed with courage and determination, could change the world. And she was ready to keep fighting. If this story touched your heart, like, share, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell for more powerful, soul-touching stories that restore faith in humanity.